Introduction. A Family Gathering. They say that everyone is on a journey to find purpose and meaning in this chaotic world. Sometimes we find people who are kindred spirits that help us along our way. It is rare to find someone whose worldview mirrors our own, never mind finding four such parallel thinkers. Add to this an insatiable desire to perform dark magical spells with blood sacrifices, and the chances of finding like-minded people are slim to none. I was lucky. We called our coven LSD, Lucifer's Disciples. We all brought our own unique qualities to the group. There was Dan Patterson, practitioner of the sacred art of drug magic. A hippie, Dan's outfits typically consisted of tie-dyed Grateful Dead t-shirts, corduroy pants, and ragged sandals. Dan stood about 6 feet tall and had large, bright blue eyes, a short goatee, and a long ponytail. He believed that all of the world's religions started with the rise of psychedelic substances and was convinced that Jesus Christ was really another name for the red mushroom that Christ followers used to experience his presence. Those who didn't know Dan assumed he was only trying to justify his habits. While some called him a druggie, his friends knew better. There was Stephen, who wore only black suits. His head was shaved completely bald except for a small island of hair near the top of his forehead. Out from the front of his hair protruded a long lock that draped down over the left side of his face. He had brown eyes and was average in height. Despite his odd haircut, Stephen was extremely good-looking, and therefore he had a way with women. Even Dan's mom, and annoyingly enough my own mom, would get flustered in his presence. Stephen's mother died giving birth to him. His father was an uninterested alcoholic who spent most of his nights at the bar, drowning his disappointments in strong drink. Stephen was a theistic Satanist and a conjurer of sex magic. He believed the Satan of the Bible was a deliverer, destined to lead humanity to a higher state of consciousness and bliss. He used his biblical knowledge to coax young, straight-and-narrow goody-goody girls into acting out his wicked and degrading sex rituals. Afterwards, he would laugh at them and tell them precisely why what they had done was wrong and perverse according to the Bible. I started hanging around Stephen because he was a victim of circumstance. I felt bad about his mother's early demise and recognized that he had no control over the world he was born into, same as me. Destiny was Stephen's girlfriend, or at least she thought she was. She had an hourglass-shaped body, and her face was rather ordinary, though she had very pretty teeth, big brown doe eyes, and long, flowing black hair. Destiny's mother was a heroin addict living out of a shelter in Lowell, a large city that abutted the town of Dracut, where the rest of us live. Her father had left without any notice when she was 13. Destiny wore the submissive outfits that Stephen picked out for her. It was not unusual for her to show up at my house wearing a leather sex mask with a zipper covering her mouth, trailing a leash from her dog collar. In junior high, you couldn't shut her up. Now it would be remarkable if she said more than 2 words. Her submissiveness was why I figured Stephen liked her. She had been part of our crew since freshman year, and since she never complained, we let her into the coven. Adam Medeiros was by far my closest friend in the coven. We were all close, but Adam and me shared what I would describe as a cosmic bond. Since our mothers were best friends, it was only natural that Adam and me developed a special friendship. His mother, Miriam, was Jewish, which meant that even though she was a Messianic Jew, Adam still participated in the same rituals that most young Jewish boys did. Adam was also half Greek, but at first glance you might guess he was full. He was around 5'10" with long hair that was styled as if someone put a bowl on his head and shaved completely around it. At 14, Adam had seen his father fall from a billboard to his death. He never talked about it, just carried on with life as usual, but the incident turned him into a deep thinker. Most of his studies were of magical potions. He collected potion bottles, which were mostly just old beer and wine bottles, as well as several medieval apothecary vials his dad had bought for him. Adam was also a student of ancient mythologies. From the time we were in 8th grade, we would combine our disposable incomes and buy antiquated spell books. Soon we had amassed a decently sized library of rare books on the occult and demonology. Together we would spend hours attempting to recreate the rituals of the ancient Babylonians and invoke the gods Marduk and Ashur. Finally, there's me, Jeff. I'm about 6'3" with hazel eyes and bleach blonde hair with brown roots, and I've been called lanky, but only by my superficial teachers in high school. My primary area of interest was always in ancient magic. There was always something about performing a ritual designed so many years ago that gave me a sense of power and control. Not long into my studies, I came to believe that the Egyptian Book of the Dead held secrets that had not yet been unlocked. I was a student of all magic, Egyptian, Celtic, Sumerian. It made no difference to me. I believed that they all contained aspects of truth and wisdom and power. I didn't specialize in any one form as my other friends did. Instead, I sought a more general knowledge of cultural magic. Though we had formed a coven, we were not typical Wiccans that you may find buying nonsense spell books in the New Age section of your local Barnes & Noble. We all agreed that the popular organized variety was bullshit. As tempting as some of the rituals seemed, bury some nails around your house, rub your belly, pat your head, and you'll get the job of your dreams, this couldn't be further from what we did. We would often perform dark rituals requiring blood sacrifices and much debauchery. Looking back, we probably conjured up the dark arts to fulfill our youthful lusts. It became more of a justification for our actions than anything else. Ironically, our coven formed largely because of our parents' past membership in the same fungelical church. That's the term we used to describe a church that was both fundamental and evangelical. It was actually Faith Baptist Church, and its congregation met in a small white building out in the farm section of Dracut. The pastor was Adam's uncle, Steve Smythe. None of our parents still attend. It was 1999. It was a time where peace-seekers, industrial ravers, and urban poets traveled from all different parts of the country to experience Woodstock. Regardless of background, everyone gathered at a small farm in upstate New York to experience 3 days of peace, love, and music. Counterculturalists had been putting on this show since long before any of us were born. We came for the same reason that we performed spells, out of the sheer enjoyment of being part of a ritual older than ourselves. Aside from all the festivities, music, and late-night raves, the best part of that summer was that weekend in New York. Our entire group was there. As dusk was falling on the second night, Adam said he had to leave just as I was beginning to nod off, enjoying some good black tar heroin. "What?" I said, half in a trance. "Wait until tomorrow, man. I can't take you now. I'm nodding off. I'll crash the car if I drive right now." "Give me your keys, then," he demanded. I mulled it over. Adam would occasionally get in these manic moods when he just wanted to be alone, and I reasoned that this was the case that night. I could tell he was going to annoy the hell out of me if I didn't give him the keys, so I handed them over, figuring I could hitch a ride with Stephen the next day. "Make sure you drop the car off at my house right after you get back," I said to him sternly. He nodded his head. I didn't think much of it. I closed my eyes and started nodding intensely. Chapter 1. Paradox. The shrieking ring of the phone brought me back to reality. Whatever island I'd been vacationing on in my head was now very far away. I became more aware of the here and now, and my head began to feel as if it were splitting open. "Mom," I whimpered, half expecting her to answer. After I realized that I couldn't will an end to the ringing, I picked up the phone, and holding the receiver to my head, I regretted that last drink. Groggily, I let out a dull, "Hello?" No response. I heard muffled crying in the background. "Who the hell is this?" I demanded. "Jeff," the voice on the other end of the phone said. "Adam's dead." I recognized the voice. It was Mikey, the brother of my best friend, Adam. The sobbing continued as I tried to process what he had said. I eked out a stupid question, asking, "What do you mean?" "He shot himself," Mikey said quietly. "Or at least that's what they're telling me." I didn't know what to say. There was a short silence while I tried to gather my thoughts. "I'll be right over," I responded finally, and hung up the phone. I threw on a pair of wind pants, grabbed my Tree of Life sweatshirt, snorted a knockout bag of dope, and headed out the door, unable to believe what I'd heard. Adam lived about 10 minutes from my house. I got into my beaten-up Toyota, lit a cigarette, and tried to make sense of what had happened. The keys were under the floor mat, as was typical when Adam borrowed my car. Is this why he left Woodstock early? Had he been planning this all along? Adam was never the depressed type. I mean, he'd seen his share of bad days, but we all had. His dad's death was tragic, but he never seemed to dwell on it. He was always the most rational and supportive member of the group, the one we all talked to when our lives would turn to shit. By the time I pulled up to the house, the news still hadn't set in. I half expected to find that Destiny, Stephen, Dan, and Adam were all having a joke at my expense. I soon realized how wrong I had been. Adam lived at the end of a cul-de-sac, and his house abutted the state forest. What I liked best about Adam's house was that no houses could be built on the left side of the property. It was nice not to have so many nosy neighbors around. Behind his house, the woods went on for miles, and its decrepit old trees offered much cover for our horrible deeds. As I slid my Tercel into park, I quickly realized that his front doorway was roped off. There were marked police cars everywhere. I forced myself out of the car, unsure if I was ready for what I'd see in there. It was at that moment that I saw Stephen, Dan, Destiny, and Mikey all standing in a circle. I walked over to them, only to find Adam's mother, Miriam, on the ground, sobbing hysterically. I sat down next to her and gave her a long hug, not knowing what to say. What could I say? After a short while, Miriam began to compose herself, but was still shaking uncontrollably. She attempted to light a cigarette, but could not manage to properly use the lighter. Stephen held out his lighter and lit the cigarette for her. "I haven't heard much from the police," she said, nodding her head toward the end of the driveway. "This morning, 2 policemen knocked on my door and told me that Adam had shot himself with a shotgun. Apparently, our neighbor, Mr. Donahue, found him when he was walking his dog early this morning." Her voice trailed off as tears began to stream down her face. She began to hyperventilate. Mikey sat next to her and continued where she left off. "That's all we know right now." Stephen looked like he was ready to explode, and Dan stared off into space, shaking his head every once in a while. Destiny's face was blank, as usual. "This is messed up," I said, noting the obvious, as usual. "I want to know why the whole forest is roped off," Mikey said. "They've blocked it off all along the tree line over onto Cheever Avenue. They're not letting anyone in." Stephen stood up, declaring, "I'm going down there to find out what the hell is happening," and stormed off. Dan and Mikey quickly followed him. I began to join them, but hesitated as I looked back at Miriam. She explained that she wasn't all right, but said she would stay put as long as I promised that we would tell her what we discovered in the woods. I left her crying on her lawn and caught up with the guys. Destiny trailed behind the group at her normal pace. I'd be lying if I said the police had never heard of us. The truth is, we'd run into them frequently. Our ceremonies were constantly broken up because neighbors and owners of nearby property were always quick to call the police due to our loud chanting and screaming. As we neared the police tape, Detective Garland jumped out of an unmarked car and used himself as a barrier between us and the tape. I could tell from the gleam in Stephen's eyes that he was considering trying to knock him down and get past. Detective Garland noticed the look, too, though I doubt he would mind such an easy excuse to lock Stephen up. "Where do you guys think you're going?" the detective snarled. "Get out of our way, Juvie Dick," Stephen said sharply. I had always liked Detective Garland. When I was arrested for selling amphetamines in the 9th grade, he let me off with a slap on the wrist and didn't pressure me to give anyone up. Stephen, on the other hand, had an uncomfortable history with the middle-aged detective. He had slept with Garland's 16-year-old daughter, Chrissy, and it was clear that Garland had never gotten over it. The detective picked on him every chance he got, and he got plenty of chances, as Stephen was never one to back down from a fight. Rumor had it that Garland told Destiny about Stephen's philandering, but we never knew for sure. As Stephen edged closer to the lawman, I quickly intervened, trying to defuse the situation. "We have to go down there," I said. "Our friend is down there." I spoke through gritted teeth, trying to not show my disgust for the police system that had put Destiny in an abusive foster home. Garland eyed us suspiciously. "Your friend was down here," he said. "The coroner came for him already. There's nothing left for you to see." "What the hell happened here?" Dan asked shakily, looking around as if someone was watching us. "Well, now, boys, that's what we're trying to figure out," Garland said unsympathetically. "If you'd all just head back up to that boy's mother's house and make sure Miriam's all right, we'll take care of—" "Detective, the commissioner wants to talk to you," a young rookie in a marked police car said, interrupting him suddenly. Garland was put off. "You boys go back to Miriam," he told us, and walked over to the police car. I looked at Dan, but he was looking at Stephen. Stephen, in turn, was whispering something to Mikey. Destiny stood behind us all. I could tell that we were all debating the same question. Should we make a run for it? Dan's eyes met mine, and I could see that he, at least, was going to make a break for it. Just as he gave me this look, we heard hideous screaming coming from Adam's house. It sounded like the scream of a dying person, just like the kind you hear in slasher movies. Like wolves tearing after a deer, we ran like hell. When we got to Adam's house, we saw men coming out the front door carrying long file boxes of notebooks and textbooks. They hurried into the black SUV that was parked outside. Miriam was screaming as she was being restrained by a man in a cheap black suit. She was swearing and kicking to get free. Without a second's thought, Stephen reached into his black suit coat, producing a razor-sharp ATAM, ready to attack. A man jumped out of his SUV and warned him cautiously, "Hey, I wouldn't do that, son." "I ain't your son," Stephen fired back. "I'm Sergeant McKaylee," he said, and put his hand on the butt of his sidearm. "Put the weapon down." The entire time this was going on, Miriam was screaming at the top of her lungs. "They won't let me in my own house. They're taking Adam's stuff." "We're confiscating this stuff," Sergeant McKaylee said to Miriam, then ordered the other man to let her go. At McKaylee's orders, the man in the suit released Miriam, and she fell to the ground crying. McKaylee turned to face Stephen. "You know, Sonny, you go around pulling weapons on officers of the law, you're going to get yourself shot. Now, if you don't put that knife down right now, I'll forget that your friend died today and haul your ass in." Stephen put his knife down. "Let me see the warrant," Dan demanded. Sergeant McKaylee and the other suited man ignored Dan's demand, jumped into their SUV, and peeled out of the driveway. Miriam stood and wagged her fist at him. "You bastards!" she yelled. Mikey asked his mother what had happened. Miriam was struck with grief, and at first she appeared to be incoherent. After looking at the ground, she said, as calmly as she could manage, "They took Adam's stuff. They came to look for evidence, but they took his stuff. They even took his bottle collection. They wouldn't let me inside of my house. My own damn house!" That was all I needed to hear, and before I knew it, I was running up the stairs. I could hear by the echoing thumps that the rest of the coven was racing behind me. Looking back, I noted that Destiny was likely waiting outside with Miriam. Once we were all in Adam's room, Mikey let out a scream of anger. Adam's shelves were all empty. His desk, usually covered in notebooks and ancient religious manuals, was cleared off. I opened his drawers and found nothing in them. Adam's room was completely empty. There was nothing that remained except the bare furniture. Mikey fell to his feet and cried. "You guys smell that?" Stephen asked us. In all of the excitement, we overlooked what was really the most obvious change. The walls were now painted white. The room smelled of fresh paint. Adam would always draw on his walls, using them like a giant canvas to bang out his complicated incantations and theorems. His mother never stopped him, believing that he was just expressing himself. To see the room now, covered by the drab white paint, gave me an eerie feeling. "Who were those guys?" Dan asked out loud. We were all contemplating that same question by this point, but Dan articulated our suspicions about the police officers. Mikey looked like he was going to snap. Putting on an evil scowl, he stomped out of the room and down the stairs. "Mikey!" Stephen yelled, following close behind him as he ran down the wooden stairs. "Something's not right here," I said to Dan. "No kidding, Jeff. No kidding." We could hear the sound of cars pulling up outside. The family must be here, I thought. I could hear Destiny's voice through Adam's window, but I couldn't make out what she said. Still, in disbelief, I looked around at the blank room again, then turned and headed down the stairs. Out in the front yard, Miriam was talking to her sister Lizzie. Pastor Smythe got out of the driver's side of one of the cars that had pulled up, alert to what had happened. I turned my face, trying to avoid eye contact with the pastor, but it was too late. He had seen me. "Jeff!" he yelled. I turned and met Pastor Smythe. He was a tall, balding man, and his face was long and thin. He was wearing a dress shirt, complete with sharply pleated dress pants. He wore a tie loosely around his neck. "Jeff," he said, already lecturing me, "this is what happens when you play games with Satan. He brings nothing but death and destruction." I didn't have the patience to argue with him that day. Typically, I would have jumped at the chance, but I was exhausted. I looked at Stephen, whose understanding of the Bible I knew to rival Pastor Smythe's, but even he wasn't in the mood to argue. Our coven huddled near the doorway as Mikey greeted the arriving family members. Miriam was hugging Lizzie as Pastor Smythe talked with members of Adam's family whom I'd never met. Deciding to leave, I said goodbye to my friends and went to say goodbye to Miriam, who was still dazed. Mikey stepped in and explained that the wake would be the next day and that he'd call me later on with the details. I hugged him and soon found myself driving away. I went through the events of the day over and over again in my mind, but nothing made sense. I stopped at the liquor store on my way home and picked up a bottle of Jack Daniels. It had been Adam's favorite. "This one's for you," I thought, chugging it down. When I got home, I went right to my desk and took out several baggies of KOs, street-grade heroin, mixed them into one big line, and snorted it up using a straw. It felt early in the day because I had slept so late. Everything had happened so quickly. Looking back, it may have been that my perspective was clouded by the heroin, but that's what I remember about that day. As I lay down, I felt my eyelids get heavier and heavier. "Adam, you stupid son of a bitch," I thought as my eyelids finally got too heavy to keep open. And with that, I nodded off to another. Chapter 2. Funeral for a Friend. The next morning, I woke up to my doorbell's annoying ring and cursed the day Beethoven wrote his Fifth Symphony. My mother was on a cruise with her boyfriend, so I pulled myself out of bed and stumbled downstairs. I opened the door to reveal Dan, standing there in black pleated pants and a white button-up dress shirt. Stephen was with him, in a black suit coat with a red handkerchief in the pocket, black pants, a red collared shirt, and a black and red tie. Destiny stood behind him, in a plain black skirt and a thick black veil that I wasn't sure she could even see out of. They were dressed for a wake. Adam's wake. I had forgotten all about it, but now memories of the previous day kicked me in the teeth stronger than any drug. I invited them in, lighting up a cigarette. As Dan passed by me, he had a strange look on his face. Looking closely, I noticed that his pupils were normal size. This was unprecedented, because Dan was an acid freak. "We thought you'd be sleeping late," Dan said, seeing my surprise at his complexion. "Mikey tried calling you last night. We all did." "Yeah, I thought you were dead too," Stephen said with a weak smile. His word use made us all realize what we were here for, and the group fell silent. "I have to get ready," I said, still half asleep. Walking down the hall in my silk boxer shorts and my Mother Earth t-shirt, I could hear Stephen tell Destiny to make herself useful and put on some coffee. Then I heard her going through the cabinets trying to find the coffee maker. As I walked into my room, Dan's hand appeared, stopping the door from closing all the way. "Hey, Jeff," he said soberly. "Today I'm going to be clean, in tribute to Adam." He stared at my desk. A mirror, razor blade, and a cut straw were out in the open. "Yeah," I said. "I think I should do that too. For Adam." The wake was a circus, with Adam's closed coffin the main attraction. Mobs of people I didn't recognize were lined up to pay their respects. Stephen, Dan, Destiny, and I were all in line together. Dr. Smythe oversaw the events and kept his place in the family processional line. Soon it was our turn to kneel and pray in front of the casket. As we started to repeat the gestures and actions of the other mourners, Destiny laughed out loud. She said, "Man, Adam wouldn't want this." Destiny didn't talk all that often, but when she did, she would speak the truth. This was no exception, and we all recognized the truth of her statement. At that, we formed a semicircle around Adam's casket. We summoned the god Pluto to take care of our departed friend in the underworld. Naturally, this made quite a stir at the predominantly Christian wake, but I didn't care. Soon I began down the processional line, first expressing my condolences to Miriam. She looked like she hadn't slept in a month. Mikey was dazed, but I gave him a strong hug. Next was Miriam's sister, Lizzie, who was sobbing quietly. Pastor Smythe was next in line. He shook his head as he grabbed my hand. As it was a typical wake, none of us could stomach the formal atmosphere, and we took off once Destiny got through the receiving line. There was complete silence in Stephen's caddy as we drove back to my house. The emotions of the day almost completely drowned out the mysteries of yesterday. Almost. "Did anyone find anything out about the officers from yesterday?" I asked, not expecting a response. "Damn, I tried calling you last night," Dan said in a forgetful manner. "I talked to Sarah. She said they're officially calling Adam's death a suicide. Then she said something about ancient Eblite script." Sarah was Dan's sister who worked as the dispatcher for the Lowell Police Department. I sat up straight. "What about Eblite script?" I asked. "I don't know exactly what she meant, because I had just finished my K6 from Woodstock, so I was a little out of it," Dan said. "I tried calling her back today, but I didn't get an answer." My mind raced. So Adam did kill himself, the selfish prick. "Did she mention anything about them taking the notebooks and his other things?" I asked, getting back on track. "Nah, man," Dan said. "But I was pretty wasted, and after that I went into a hole and, you know." Yeah, I knew. Drug magic. We tried to not perform any ceremonies or drug rituals that day, out of respect. It was supposed to be a day of remembrance for a great magician and an even greater friend. After the wake, we spent the rest of the day trying unsuccessfully to forget our sorrows. After a couple of beers, things got crazy. But then they always did. It inevitably led to the ritualistic use of drugs. Hey, we tried, Adam. Tuesday morning was a haze, as I was both painfully hungover and still miserable over Adam. I was getting dressed when my attention was drawn to an open book on my desk. I didn't remember reading anything the previous night, but then again, I didn't remember much of anything from last night. Curious, I looked at the page. It was the third volume of History by Herodotus. I was skimming the text when something jumped off the page at me. Herodotus was discussing the practices of the ancient Nasmoneans, explaining how, for divination, they betake themselves to the sepulchres of their own ancestors, and, after praying, lie down to sleep upon their graves. By the dreams which then come to them, they guide their conduct. That's it, I thought, and continued to get ready. We took separate cars to the funeral. Dan came with me, and Destiny went with Stephen. "Does he always make her sit in the back?" I asked Dan. "I never noticed," Dan replied. Dan had just ingested a little round pill with a Mercedes sign on it. Dan ate hallucinogens the way normal people ate Tic Tacs. It was who he was spiritually. He claimed that they gave him more power, but I always figured it was how he dealt with a disappointing reality. I know how big a demon drug addiction was, but hey, I couldn't blame anyone for using something to take their mind off reality, especially on that day. The funeral service was a farce. People who didn't know Adam from their asses got up and talked at length about what a godly kid he was. Adam was my friend, but he was as big of a mess-up as anyone I'd ever met. These church people painted his life as a fairy tale, saying how he fell away at the end, but once saved, always saved. I wonder what he exactly was being saved from. A burning eternity in hell? It didn't matter anymore. Outside the church, we noticed the funeral worker readying the hearse. He handed out little purple flags with magnets on the bottom for us to put on our vehicles. It was supposed to distinguish us from the other motorists as we drove in the funeral procession. We finally arrived at West Lawn Cemetery, several cars behind the hearse. The procession parked in a row beside the long-forgotten monuments of death. When we arrived, I signaled for Stephen to meet us behind the large statue next to what would soon become Adam's final resting place. Crazy thoughts went through my mind as we were waiting for Destiny and Stephen to walk up to the monument. I started to wonder if Adam was even in the casket. My thoughts were cut short as I saw Stephen strut up the little hill. He rested one hand on a time-worn statue of a young woman. "How are you guys doing?" Stephen said, with his head down and his eyes fixated at the ground. "I'm pretty far from good right now, Stephen," I said, trying not to sound too irritated, but I could see from his expression that I had failed. "Listen, guys, I have an idea. The cops aren't telling us anything. Stephen, does Miriam have any new info?" Stephen shook his head. "Someone stole Adam's notebooks and every other book he had." "The FBI," Destiny suggested. "It may have been the FBI, but I really don't know," I said. "The fact is, one of our best friends, a man who also happens to be a member of Lucifer's disciples, has been killed. I think it's our responsibility to figure out why and how." "Where are you going with this?" Stephen asked, his voice rising in an aggravated tone. At that, I began to explain what I had read that morning in Herodotus' History, about the necromancy practices of the ancient Nasmoneans. I explained that, like the Nasmoneans, I had to sleep alone on Adam's fresh grave. Maybe then I could invoke Adam to help us figure out who these interested officers were. I explained that even though this was a long shot, it was our only chance. My having to do it alone was a lie, but it was necessary for me to be able to concentrate. Given the bond that Adam and I had shared, I stood the best chance of being able to summon him. We all agreed that this was our only opportunity to find any answers right now. Dan offered me some acid, but I explained that I had to be able to sleep, and acid played with my mind. The real reason was that I did not want my consciousness altered more than I could control, but I told Dan it would just be hard enough to fall asleep on the bare ground. I sleepwalked through the remainder of the funeral, unable to concentrate on any of Pastor Smythe's words. I was too busy thinking about later that night.